Hello everyone, this is AndresRestart, and today I would like to have a simple discussion about what seems to be a very likely announcement in the Nintendo Switch 2 Direct, and that is for a remaster for a big Legend of Zelda game. But depending on how this remaster is handled, it could be something that is very exciting for fans, or it could be something that's a little underwhelming. And it might also have some very interesting implications for what may be next for Zelda in the coming years. And that's what I want to dive a bit further into today. But before going forward, let me take this moment to point out that I am aiming to reach 50,000 subscribers by the time the Switch 2 launches. So if you find yourself enjoying my content, I would appreciate it if you could subscribe and hit that notification bell. So I first want to make the distinction between remasters and remakes, because I think oftentimes a lot of people mix up the terminology here. A remaster is an enhancement from the original work building on that already established code, and then a remake would be building it up from the ground up based off the original, but it's still totally new. And in general, remakes are even more ambitious than remasters, but there have also been some remasters that can still be pretty significant. And I think it's important to specify this now because there have been a lot of theories, a lot of which coming from myself, that there will be a big Zelda remake early on for Switch 2. I think for the 40th anniversary for The Legend of Zelda, which would be next year in 2026, and I've talked about several times that I think the most likely one to be remade will be The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, and that would work really well to celebrate the history of Zelda and perhaps even help to excite more people going into the new live-action Zelda movie that by that point we may start learning some details about. But until then, I think there may be other Zelda offerings we see. However, at the end of the day, I think we should also recognize that while I think there's some pretty good reason to believe that there will be a remake of Ocarina of Time, Nintendo could go in a different direction. And maybe they could also do both, but it does kind of depend on how big they go with this other project I'm referring to here, which is a remaster for The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. Now, personally, I don't want to see a remaster for Breath of the Wild because I'd rather Nintendo invest their resources into other Zelda projects like just the next new Zelda game and maybe a remake for Ocarina of Time, things along those lines. We already have Breath of the Wild on our Switch. The Switch is backwards compatible with the Switch 2, so us being able to play Breath of the Wild in an enhanced way might not really be that exciting. However, there is reason to believe that Nintendo is going to enhance Breath of the Wild in some way, and it may even be its own dedicated release, and it could even be considered a pretty decent remastering. The reason why a lot of people think that something like this may be in the works is because when we go back to 2023, there were reported technical demonstrations at Gamescom for the Nintendo Switch 2. One was the Unreal Engine 5 Matrix demo, another was for Breath of the Wild, and this was reported by several credible outlets, so it's not really doubted that there was a behind closed doors technical demonstration of the Switch 2. It wasn't the Switch 2 itself, it was a computer simulating what the Switch 2 could in theory do, and this Breath of the Wild technical demonstration had the game running at a 4K resolution at 60 frames per second with virtually no load times. And I will also mention that with the Matrix demo, apparently that one was showcasing impressive ray tracing effects that the Switch 2 in theory could do. But those are just technical demonstrations. Tech demos oftentimes don't become games. However, last year, this user known as Midori, one of the more credible leakers out there, although as of late hasn't really been saying much, last I checked they go under the alias of Ryan from the Bronx, but they're responsible for sharing out or leaking out a whole bunch of different codename projects that Nintendo is working on. And simply considering the history of Midori, it's already a high likelihood that there may be something behind this because their leaks are, for the most part, spot on. They did talk about a Switch 2 reveal happening late last year. That did not happen, but that is one occurrence where they were off, and yet there is a long list of all types of leaks from all sorts of different companies, including Nintendo, where they were correct. And in terms of these codename projects, they had talked about Ounce, which we now know to be the case. Ounce is a real codename. They had also put out codenames for different projects that we later learned were legitimate, like Super Mario Party Jamboree, and The Legend of Zelda Echoes of Wisdom. And one of those other codenames was Yu King O. The O would be standing for Ounce, the codename of Switch 2, and Yu King is actually the codename for Breath of the Wild, so the implication is that there would be a Switch 2 version of Breath of the Wild. So between the technical demonstrations and this leak of this Breath of the Wild remaster for Switch 2, we think there's a good chance that Nintendo is revisiting Breath of the Wild in some way, and this may materialize into a whole-on new release. Now, personally, I've liked the idea that maybe there are just going to be some popular Switch 1 games that are going to see enhancements, and perhaps that's where that codename comes from. But there's also a good chance, perhaps an even greater chance, that Nintendo's going to have a dedicated physical release of Breath of the Wild that has these enhancements. Now, personally, if you take Breath of the Wild, you upscale the resolution, you run it at 60 frames per second, and the few load times we see, like when we fast travel or go inside a shrine or something like that, if that's reduced significantly, those would be nice, but it's not worth spending $70 for. It's not a new experience, and to me, it wouldn't even really be that much of a visual upgrade. Now, I do think it'd be a great thing to do so people can continue to buy Breath of the Wild. Breath of the Wild has continued to sell throughout the entire Switch era. If you want to give it longer legs, yes, do something like this. But I don't think it should be treated as like a big release for a particular month. I think it should be kind of like a companion title to another bigger release in a particular month. To me, that makes the most sense. Maybe it's a launch title alongside the new Mario Kart, for example, and some sort of party game. You do something like that, I think most people would be okay with it. I don't think it's going to be the kind of release that will have a whole bunch of people buying Switch 2s. But if they already buy a Switch 2 and they never got a chance to play Breath of the Wild, maybe then they would consider giving it a try. Or, like I said earlier, maybe it's not going to be its own release, it's going to be something you can pay a small upgrade fee for, maybe $10 or something, or maybe NSO members get it for free. And that's a practice Nintendo uses for a few different games. Assuming you have the game already, of course. But Nintendo does have an opportunity here to go a bit bigger. It's possible that Breath of the Wild could be getting more of a remaster treatment than just having a higher resolution with a better frame rate and better loading. They could go back and improve the visuals more significantly. Maybe they'll use more detailed textures. Maybe they will implement some ray tracing. The lighting could then see a dramatic improvement. And if you start doing things like that, then the game could start to look substantially better. And at that point, then the argument for it being a more meaningful release becomes more compelling, especially if they include new content. Now, Tears of the Kingdom came out in 2023. That was not that long ago, and there were many of us that were clamoring for, even expecting, myself included, that there would be some sort of expansion pass or a DLC for Tears of the Kingdom, because before that point, most major Nintendo titles had DLC, although starting in 2023, they started phasing out that strategy, likely because they were gearing up for the next generation of Nintendo, the Switch 2. But the Zelda devs on multiple occasions have told us that there are no plans for Tears of the Kingdom DLC. Now, if they put out a Breath of the Wild remaster and there's new content in there on top of the already released DLC from back in 2017, like maybe like a new adventure, it wouldn't be the same thing, because DLC for Tears of the Kingdom is not new content for Breath of the Wild, right? Those are two different games, and even if it was for a Tears of the Kingdom remaster, a new episode or epilogue quest or something like that to come in a separate new release still would not be technically DLC. And on the note of Tears of the Kingdom, because I do think that if Nintendo does remaster Breath of the Wild, people will want the same for Tears of the Kingdom. Depending on how substantial of an improvement is, maybe they just do it for both and there's just a cheap upgrade fee. But if it is something more substantial, I'm not entirely sure what they'll do with Tears of the Kingdom. They may wait for a little while longer. But like many Nintendo remasters, especially the more ambitious ones, there is some sort of new adventure added on top of that. You look at Super Mario 3D World plus Bowser's Fury. You look at Kirby's Return to Dreamland Deluxe, Magalore's Epilogue. You look at Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition with Future Connected. And then there's even Xenoblade Chronicles X Definitive Edition, the new one is about to come out, that also has some new content that's going to be added as well. And so there is certainly a precedent that has been set throughout the Switch era for bigger remasters to have new content added in. And if Nintendo does something bigger like this, like including a new area for us to explore, maybe something that kind of explains the connection better between Breath of the Wild and Tears, or maybe it's an epilogue quest that takes place after both Breath and Tears, but it's almost more like a side adventure so you don't need to play Tears of the Kingdom. If they did something like this, I think it would excite a lot of Zelda fans, especially if there are more substantial visual improvements and such, and then all of a sudden that's a more significant release. And yes, I think people would be into it, but at the same time, if they do something like this, I would then think that decreases the chances that Nintendo's working on something else that could come out for the 40th anniversary, and my hopes in an Ocarina of Time remake would diminish a little bit here, at least to come out relatively soon. And I'm not saying this would take away from the next big major 3D Zelda game, that's going to be years away regardless, but Nintendo could go in this kind of direction. Now, what I think is going to happen is that there likely will be, at some point in this first year of Switch 2, a way to play an enhanced version of Breath of the Wild. I don't ultimately think that there's going to be a big remaster of Breath of the Wild. I think it's going to be done in a more smaller way, as I described earlier. And by doing something like this, it's not really taking away from any resources from future Zelda projects that I think would be more meaningful, like an Ocarina of Time remake, and of course, eventually, the next big new 3D Zelda developed ground up for the Switch 2. But this is a situation I'm keeping my eyes peeled for, because depending on what Nintendo does, I think that will be suggestive of what they have planned next. Which, by the way, I think there's a very good chance we see something about this in the Nintendo Switch 2 Direct. Oftentimes, Zelda is included as part of a console launch, and while I don't think anything major is going to come out in 2025, they may at least want to give us an update on what is going on with Zelda for the Switch 2. So maybe they just tell us that the next big Zelda is in development, maybe they give us a hint towards a big remake for the 40th anniversary, or maybe they simply just tell us about this remaster that there were tech demos for back in 2023 and a codename leak for back in 2024. A lot of those codename projects seem like projects that are supposed to come out relatively soon. But I'm curious what you all think. What would you like to see Nintendo do regarding the future of Zelda? Do you want to see a more ambitious remaster for Breath of the Wild with a new story or adventure? And if so, do you think that would take away from other Zelda projects like maybe an Ocarina of Time remake for the 40th anniversary next year? Or is there a world where we can get all of it? I'm doubtful, but I want to know what you all think in the comments below. This is AndresRestart. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and I'll see you all really soon. Take care. Bye.